Because of WikiLeaks, we find out more information about what we've done in Iraq. Of course, millions of documents were released. The reason Bradley Manning faces at least 20 years, maybe more, up to a life sentence, is because he revealed information the government didn't want you to know. It's ugly secrets. Well, The Guardian has done a terrific piece along with BBC Arabic that shows exactly what we were up to. And it features two guys, Colonel James Kaufman, retired, and Colonel James Steele, retired. Now, they weren't quite retired because they went back into Iraq and worked with General Petraeus and the rest of our forces to help the Iraqis set up special police commandos. Now, those special police units wound up doing a tremendous amount of torture and, oh, by the way, some death squads. In fact, at the height of the civil war in Iraq, 3,000 people were showing up dead every single month. Now, I was naive enough to believe at the time that, hey, listen, we opened up that Pandora's box, so we were responsible for what happened afterwards, but I didn't think that we actually participated in it. Well, it turns out that we at least gave tacit approval and oftentimes active approval for exactly some of the most hideous things that were being done in Iraq. And when you see the history of Colonel James Steele, you begin to understand why. First of all, he was the same exact guy we sent down to El Salvador to set up the death squads there. And guess what happened in El Salvador? A tremendous civil war, just like in Iraq, where there were death squads and then retaliation and a vicious cycle of violence. So why not repeat that mistake? In fact, Celerino Castillo is a senior DEA agent. When he found out Steele was headed to Iraq under the auspices of Donald Rumsfeld, here's what he said. I first heard about Colonel James Steele going to Iraq, and I said, they're going to implement what is known as the Salvadoran option in Iraq. And that's exactly what happened. And I was devastated because I knew the atrocities that were going to occur in Iraq, which we knew had occurred in El Salvador. And of course, it turns out he was right about that. In case you're wondering and you forgot, El Salvador was a long time ago. How many people killed in the war in El Salvador? Smallest country in Latin America. 75,000 deaths. Thanks a lot, Colonel Steele. Really appreciate it. So, of course, Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld look at that and go, mission accomplished. Nicely done. Right-wing death squads. Let's send them over to Iraq. Throughout the Guardian piece, you see Rumsfeld lavishing praise on Steele. Oh, we've got the right guy in Iraq. This guy named Steele, he's doing the right things for us. And, of course, Cheney had worked with him in Panama as well when he was part of the George H.W. Bush administration. And by the way, so in El Salvador we had 75,000 deaths. How many deaths did we have in Iraq? Well, according to those same documents that were leaked through WikiLeaks, but this is the government estimate, so it is actually incredibly conservative and low, 109,032 deaths in Iraq between 2004 and 2009, including over 66,000 civilians. Civilians. We must be so proud. Now, even the Associated Press has both of those numbers at higher. They have it at over 110,000 deaths. Of course, some other organizations have estimated the deaths at up to 600,000, and I've even seen one estimate over 1 million. But everyone agrees at least 110,000 deaths, including a tremendous number of civilians. So, well, were these guys at least connected to General Petraeus and the higher command? Well, Colonel James Kaufman told Star and Stripes that he was, quote, Petraeus's eyes and ears out on the ground in Iraq. Fantastic. Now, let me go to a video from this series. Todd Greentree is going to talk about Colonel Steele's role.
Colonel Steele is one of the few people who understands how to conduct intelligence-driven operations against operational cells of an insurgency or terrorist organization.
So he knows how to operate that. Is it going to be a success? Well, it depends on your definition of success, right? But one thing is clear. He's doing this at the behest of Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and General Petraeus. In fact, General Muntadir al-Samari, who was a senior general in Iraq at the time, said they worked hand in hand. Now, that's actually referring to Kaufman and Petraeus. I never saw them apart. In the 40 or 50 times I saw them inside the detention centers. They knew everything that was going on there. The torture, the most horrible kinds of torture. Now, General Adnan Tabit was the head of the Special Commandos. So if anybody knows what happened, it was him. He's the guy who ordered all of it. He says, quote, "Until I left, the Americans knew about everything I did. They knew what was going on in the interrogations, and they knew the detainees." So, did we know what was happening? You betcha. No question about it. General Muntadir al-Samari again, quote, "They were secret, never declared, but the American top brass and the Iraqi leadership knew all about these prisons. The things that went on there, drilling, murder, torture, the ugliest sort of torture I've ever seen." So they saw it, and they said the Americans absolutely knew about it. There was 13 to 14 detention centers, let alone the death squads roaming the country. So then we go to General Muntadir al-Samari one more time. He says, now beginning to describe the torture, "I remember a 14-year-old who was tied to one of the library's columns, and he was tied up with his legs above his head, tied up. His whole body was blue because of the impact of the cables with which he had been beaten." Now, there's more videos explaining some of the torture, including by American journalists and Western journalists there at the time. Let's watch.
They were torturing detainees for information on the insurgency.
He hears the scream of the other guy who's being tortured, as we speak. There's the blood stains in, the corner of the desk in front of him.
The things that went on there, drilling, murder, torture, the ugliest sorts of torture I've ever seen.
So Gilles Perez was a photographer who at the time was on assignment from the New York Times. Another reporter, Peter Moss, also on assignment there, and they saw with their own eyes what was happening. More on that.
We're in a room in the library interviewing Steele, and I'm looking around, I see blood everywhere,
There were these terrible screams. There was somebody shouting, "Allah, Allah, Allah," but it wasn't, kind of religious ecstasy or something like that. These were screams of pain and terror.
The prisoners do start shouting. They are a bit like whirling dervishes. They love to scream, "Allah, Allah."
The man at the end there, seeming to enjoy the prisoners' screams, was the man who conducted those operations. He's also the same one that I quoted earlier, saying that Americans knew everything I did. Now, the other two were reporters who couldn't believe that they would be interviewing Steele and there would be a blood of pool near the detainees, and Steele would find it irrelevant, would move on. There was one particular time, according to those two, Gilles Perez and Peter Moss, and some of the other generals that were there, including the general that I quoted earlier, Muntadir al-Samari, saying, "I was with Colonel Steele. They open a door, and you see a guy hanging upside down, bloodied, and Steele calmly closes the door and moves on." He knows what's happening. So what, in fact, did they do? Well, let's hear from one of the guys who was tortured.
We would be blindfolded and handcuffed behind our backs. Then they would beat us with shovels and pipes. We'd be tied to a spit, or we'd be hung from the ceiling by our hands, and our shoulders would be dislocated.
They electrocuted me. They hung me from the ceiling. They were pulling at my ears with pliers, stamping on my head, asking me about my wife, saying they would bring her here. I remember Adnan Tabit came into the library and he told Captain Dorade and Captain Ali, "Go easy on the prisoners. Don't dislocate their shoulders." This was because people were having to undergo surgery when they were released from the library.
At one point, they actually ran a reality show in Iraq, and this is unbelievable, where they would show the tortured detainees, kind of rubbing it in people's face. "This is what we do, so you better watch out." Now, that was in the height of the sectarian conflict when thousands are dying every single month. It wasn't really like it was deterring people. Finally, General Petraeus had to call in and say, "Hey, listen, at least don't show the tortured people on TV. Is he not merciful?" Now, if you don't believe the Iraqi generals and you don't believe the reporters and you don't believe the people who were tortured, well, The Guardian also found some U.S. soldiers and troops that were there. Let me quote some of them. This is a man from the 69th Armored Regiment soldier who was deployed in Samarra in 2005. He says, "It was like the Nazis, the Gestapo basically. They, the commandos, would essentially torture anybody that they had good reason to suspect, knew something or was part of the insurgency, or supporting it, and people knew about that." He's saying that The troops knew all about it. Americans knew about it. The commanders knew all about it. One of these brave U.S. troops actually came out on the record. His name is Neil Smith. He was a 20-year-old medic based in Samara. He's now a born-again Christian and trying to make amends for what he thinks he did in Iraq. And he says, quote, "What was pretty widely known in our battalion, definitely in our platoon, was that they were pretty violent with their interrogations, that they would beat people, shock them with electric shock, stab them, I don't know what else. It sounds like pretty awful things." Now, one last soldier who was actually handing over people to be tortured, these detainees said, quote, "If somebody gets arrested and we hand them over to Mole, they're going to get their balls hooked, electrocuted, or they're going to get beaten or raped up the ass with a Coke bottle or something like that." So what we taught the right-wing death squads to do in El Salvador that led to a grotesque civil war there with 75,000 dead, we did again in Iraq. And what do we have? The same exact results. Death squads, torture, elimination of political opponents. And what happened? 110,000 dead at least. Will you, for the love of God, stop sending Colonel Steele into these situations? This is what we found out about our government. This is what our democracy was up to. If we care at all about being decent human beings and a light onto the world as we claim we are, we should never do this again. Colonel Steele is not an American hero. He is not productive. He gets the exact opposite results of what decent human beings would want. These are not some sort of glorious heroes as they were, made out to be by the right wing during the Contra scandal. By the way, Colonel Steele involved in the Contra scandal, of course. And they do these hideous things again and again, and we have to stop them. And thank God we found out what they did this time around so that we might be able to prevent it the next time around. And how did we find out? Bradley Manning. And that is, of course, why he's possibly facing a life sentence. How about the guys who did the torture, who ran the death squads, who taught people how to do the torture in the death squads? They, of course, are free to go.